necessary force in order to claim the rights over the people of the various jurisdictions, including the rights over their body, is the right to say that they can frame anyone or compel them to participate in any particular uh, sexual appetite in others that they deem fit in order to accomplish the mission, which includes the sales and distributions of sexual acts for profits and influence according to the mission. And thus it becomes an amoral scenario, at which point this situation actively engages in their maximizing their objective. So let's say you're a guy named Steven. Doesn't matter who it is, it doesn't matter if they're real. This is just a make believe legal theory. Steven subjugates himself to the whims of the objective for the status. The status say, this is what we need in order to win, so Steven does X. Now, if Steven is normally going to want to have a normal, straight sexual relationship and get married, then he would have done that without the war. But the state says you have to divorce your wife or get divorced by your wife. And he says yes, because the state's in control and there are no rights. This isn't a constitutional republic, there's status. So he has to agree. So then the state tells him to be homosexual for the mission, and he goes ahead and he performs all of his duties for the services and funding, acquiring the objective of the influence, and is a vibrant homosexual. In secret, according to the mission, because publicly he needs to have a straight lace, conservative ish look. At which point the subject becomes, we need you to be a transsexual. Well, he has to agree because the status are the loyalties. Um, so he becomes a trans woman. And so they acquire their objective. And they say, we need you to be sexually attracted to pins. And so he says, okay. And he actively endorses the pins and he plays around with the pins and he finds the ones that he writes with and he finds the ones that he likes. And, Stephen is kind of used to being a more important person, so he's not going to want the cheap little 50-cent blue ink pens. No, he's going to want a more fancy, personally tailored, expensive 50,000 or $100,000 pen because he's important and elegant. And the state can want whatever it wants, but he has standards, and so he's going to stick exclusively to his sexual market value, and he's not going to falter on this one bit. The state is going to have to accept his terms, or, I mean, that's just it. So he finds the exact pen that he's exactly into, and he begins to enjoy playing with himself as it allows the insertion. As a transsexual, the pin is able to penetrate into him concerning the genital area, and it provides the necessary ejaculation towards the interest as the exchange of fluids actively mold into the more perfect objective of the status, who, having seen it, been qualified, and frustrated about the backlip, ultimately conceded that he did technically do what they wanted and it did accomplish the mission, so everything should continue as normal. As a good status, everything has worked perfectly and he's progressed to these objectives. At which point, their status say that they have to target various characters. And so those characters have to be told to have their various sexual ventures with the targets in order to acquire their mission. And so let's say that we'll call her Brittany, actively joins David's caravan. And then this Brittany character, with all of the other girls, are actively engaged in the exchanges. And she's told to actively engage in the sexual relationships with David and make sure that he's satisfied with all of the girls that they send and that he actually likes the ones with the status more than the other nations. And so the Americans will lose because the statists actively have the superior funding, and Nazism must do everything it can in order to win. Thus, the mission must be seen to its maturity. And so Brittany has to make sure that David is the most gratified. And if David is the most gratified, then he is getting the best reactions in order to maximize his involvement. So he's given the best tips on how to gratify the secret interest that she's been spying on all of the other girls, maximizing the interest beyond the engagement of normal interests of women to actively promote the concept of the sex appeal of boys who actively getting encouraged become the heartbreakers that the older generations want them to, and thus they are prepared for the next generation who would enjoy it, and thus that next generation will continue the favor on forever and ever throughout the posterities, guaranteeing the protection of the sexual market value, which is the mutual interest of the romantic stories, essential to the interest of women. So David is actively encouraged in that engagement to actively promote all of the sensitive parts and maximize every possible advantage in order to maximize this exchange, and especially the objective, which is their interest in David's, because the more they're attracted to David, the better reaction he's going to get, and thus they're going to compromise themselves as much as possible for their enjoyment, for their emotional and chemical reaction, because all of the other girls who are not with the status confederacy will mutually be interested in him, and thus they have to be more interested in him, and thus they have to be more subject to his interest, and thus they're chemically inclined towards accepting David as the superior option, having been convicted by the Confederacy of being the patriarchy for his masculinity at the highest level, generating the highest potential release on their end. And so this would have been normalized from birth by David as they join the Caravan, which has counter surveillance technology, which means by definition the agents from the status who sent them have to take their word for whatever it is, because they don't actually have any way of recording it beyond the confession of their agents who are sent in order to become joined with David in the relationships, and if they succeed in the contracts to come back with the value, and if they fail the contracts to get over him or join the black market for witchcraft and get their revenge. Normal girl reactions to these types of situations with absolute catastrophic status powers who have access to secret weapons. Every piece of shenanigans one could imagine is by definition the legal assumption. As David is exponentially increased in his various talents, which are specifically designed for the women, such as his music career, as his engagement with the musical contracts and concerts and such, exponentially make the women as happy as physically possible in the most diverse ways possible, as the act of working for the status has relieved them to the greatest pleasures that they could have designed, because they have all of the resources to have maximized their most arbitrary, flagrant, momentary wants, which would have immediately been projected and fully satisfied according to the schedule as planned by those experts in specifically getting those reactions from them specifically. So unless they aren't attracted to what they are attracted to, which would out them making the forcing the compulsion to make the adjustments so that it would specifically personally tailor to them permanently, then by definition they would have to have become infatuated with their ideal masculinity, which is the patriarchy, which is the assertion of all authority, power, and wealth, which is their character for David, and their infatuation with them, which would generate the exponential worse catastrophic heartbreak of being separated from that if they fail their contracts, which would exponentially compound their desire for revenge, and thus their mutual engagement of networking retaliations with boyfriends and hopefuls and simps and the like, who would actively collaborate with their revenge against the breakup so that they could, as the one who's desperately attracted to the agreement being maintained, win the breakup that the other party would have easily been able to have gotten over in favor of all of the other ones who would still be there, and thus the desire to win the breakup becomes their entire identity, consuming their every waking moment. Acquiring upon their false maturity of being able to get themselves to forget about him unless he's mentioned, which would immediately trigger the catastrophic flood, the breaking of the dam, the gouging of this insatiable need to win what cannot be won, and thus the unlimited retaliations inherently attached to it, requiring their aggressive and malicious subversion of any potential conversation which would have normalized the situation into at least neutral terms where they could stomach being around the various subjects which would have materialized into them having grown out of it and thus gotten over the retaliations. And thus, their various schemes and networks and secrets and the extents, gross negligence, automated contracts defend themselves, which are the ability for them to claim that they don't know about the thing that they told somebody else to arbitrarily make, which would generically have secret passcodes under their own personalized thieves' can, generating their need to engage in the correct reporting with their passwords, specifically in order to dismantle these phantom cells if they were ever able to get over it, which of course is inherently against their most fundamental characteristics. It reminds me of a vague, I think it was an Ask Reddit comment. There was a girl who was asked at her wedding what she feared the most, and she said she feared having a baby the most. And the reason is because she has very sensitive nipples, and she thought that if she was nursing her baby, that it might react and force her to get aroused by virtue of the baby manipulating or actively playing with their nipples, which is a sensitive sexual place for her, as an example of a thing that they would assume. So, by definition, this is something that they would have actively promoted for the wet nurses, which, by definition, is something that they have verified that they would have sent to him. Interestingly enough, guys are usually the ones who are getting romantically stuck in many situations which they would normally be able to have to tolerate, except for the fact that David's character is the exact exemption to all of their positions. So, by definition, the overqualified quantities of attractiveness and sexual opportunity means, by definition, nothing was actually lost on David's side, but on their side, if they contract out of the caravan and break up with them because their society has told them to, then they have to leave. Thus, they're the ones losing, and thus those who are trying to extort them for the maximizing of using their emotional destabilized position would actively be compelling them to not get over it emotionally and thus psychologically, and thus the steps of psychological recovery would actively be barred by the dark psychologists, who would actively be maximizing the potential of their magic retaliation for the witchcraft, which generates their permanent stasis within the revenge cycle, at which point every time it's pricked, it immediately returns to the revenge cycle and the retaliation cycle and the uh, abuse as generated by the emotional manipulation into the subject as they are socially engineered into that position. Now, those who have been actively controlled without those original conditions would actively be cycled into that position, or even psychologically been manipulated into the desirability of dominatrix, would actively be pursuing dominatrix in the subversion change if the Americans win, so that they would be able to get what they want as is crafted by those who hate them, at which point they're actively seeking the position of Christian Grey in those books, which would actively be encouraged as the false romance, which would actively be um, celebrated by their society so that they could learn to enjoy it. So you understand, with the human trafficking scenario of the white nationalists, Confederate insurrectionists for the fraudulent status position of an anti-law in order to engage in the subversion by the defamation simulation, they confess to what they're doing and what they're guilty of by their accusations and their offenses. So if they conduct an assault, it indicates what they're guilty of. If they make an accusation, it indicates what they're guilty of. They're seeking to manipulate the curtailed position of mentioning the parts of them that are socially unacceptable as status extra law felons with KKK contracts. They have a two-tiered structure which puts them in a legal version of Mars that allows them to not be tampered with by arrests, which generates their full exploration of their own particulars, which the overlapping function of what is obnoxious about their particulars to the general public is then exponentially exacerbated for a pendulum swing for over extremists on one side to the over extremist on the other. So the over extremists for them personally would be the endorsement of it being supported, as that is who and what they are. Thus, the over extreme opposition to it generates the exponential funding in the conflict of those who are opposed to the thing, so that they then can be fully satisfied, but then overreact. And in their overreaction, it can be brought to the other side to support an endorsement, at which point those who would oppose to their normal social behavior, such as the homosexuals inside the Republican Party, who were actively caught as um, being against homosexuality as a closeted homosexual Republican, would actively engage in their over exacerbation against uh, homosexuality, and then would come back to the endorsement of homosexuality, at which point you have the materialization of these particulars. So anything that they're being excessive or unreasonable about is by definition them overcompensating in order to protect their specifics, which is most relevant for the parties who are engaging in the criminalizing of evidence, such as the use of secrecy in order to materialize the protection of their criminal offenses, in order to protect their agents from getting arrested for normal procedures, which is actively paid for by status instead of cash. So the Secret Service gets paid in status instead of money because they're capped at the 60,000 a year, at which point their beyond services exceeding the $60,000 value gives them excessive advantages such as drinking and driving and other criminal exchanges, which is exponentially compounded upon the secret society's arrangements, which facilitates the normalization of those behaviors as is protected by the double agents using the Confederate magic as a means of not paying their just due, at which point it becomes a black market exchange of the trading of services, as their two-tiered system is the payment of the product, at which point they have to actively maintain their non-legal functions protected by the two-tiered system in order to maintain their status, and thus it becomes not just a thing that they get to do above and beyond, but the acts of compulsion from the addiction in order to not be compromised or be viewed as an outsider or a rat to their general group, similar to police stations or military positions, which generates their arrangement to have officers who don't rat each other out. And any officer who rats each other out, such as in the Mexican military or police with the cartels, anyone who doesn't trade with those excess functions becomes the overlapping function as the outsider, and thus they become untrusted, and thus they exponentially have the rest of the department conspire against them, and thus they become specifically targeted and subverted. And so they not only have the ability to, but the compulsion to, and thus the compulsion to purchase the predetermined minimum quantity as to fit in with the rest of the group, maintaining and cultivating these exponential fetishes based upon its popularity from what they're currently retaliating against, which is exponentially making it more difficult and hard and expensive in order to engage in the subject, which materializes the price fixing or value control over the function of the offense, at which point the controlled offense that is being hyper-accelerated to be more important or higher expensive or generated for better returns is exponentially compulsory to the target members, at which point it then becomes offensive to arrest them as it was an obligation from them in their culture to participate in the particular function for its immediate releases and the advantages of these releases as a luxury acquired taste good. It asserts the value of their higher status, and thus the assertion of their higher status reaffirms it as a valuable payment as alternative to cash, normalizing the market at that exchange, at which point you understand that they're all freaky deaky creeps because it is obligatory according to those cultures.